Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back, and today in this video we will start talking about Sifat. In terms of learning outcomes and what we want to get out of this video, we want to answer a few questions. The first is, what are Sifat? What is the definition of Sifat? The second is to get an appreciation for what Sifat are and how important they are. So we'll answer two questions. We'll answer why do we apply Sifat? And we'll answer the question, what if we don't apply the Sifat? What happens to the pronunciation of letters? So Bismillah, let's start. First, let's define what does the word Sifah mean in Arabic. Simply put, Sifah means characteristic or a quality. Let's take an example, which is a kitchen cupboard. Yes, a kitchen cupboard. So if we wanted to describe a kitchen cupboard with some characteristic, so we'd open the cupboard and we can say it's deep. It's a deep cupboard. So deep is a sifah or a characteristic. Or we could say the capacity is huge. So the capacity is a characteristic. Or we could say that when we open the door, it squeaks. So there's a characteristic from a sound perspective that it squeaks. So depending on the perspective you look at the cupboard, you can give it different characteristics or qualities. Depending on the perspective or the angle you look, you can give it different characteristics. So let's move from that example to Tajweed. The same applies to letters. You look at a letter from different perspectives and you can describe its characteristic from one perspective or the other. So you could look at a letter from the perspective of the length of the sound. Or you could look at the letter from a perspective of the wind that comes out with it. At, that has a little bit of wind, versus ad, that there's no wind with that one. You could look at the letter from the perspective of the direction of sound within the mouth. Else versus s. In one of them, the direction kind of goes to upwards. The other one, the direction is downwards. So you can look at the letter from different perspectives and describe the sifat from different perspectives of the letters. So now let's describe or define sifat when we say a sifah for a letter within Tajweed. So sifat or a sifah, they are characteristics or qualities of letters which occur with the pronunciation when the letter comes to its articulation point. And these characteristics or these qualities differentiate that letter from others. Let's simplify it a bit. So if we wanted to simplify that definition, we'd say that sifat are characteristics of letters which affect the sound of letters. And they differentiate one letter or the sound of one letter from another. So now that we've defined sifat as characteristics of letters, let's move on to the second and third point. And the second point is, why do we actually study sifat? Firstly, sifat help us differentiate letters which come from the same makhraj. So in terms of the articulation point or the makhraj, if you remember from previous videos, we defined 2 or 3 letters that come from the same makhraj. However, these letters sound different. So, alto, at, ad, these 3 letters come from the same makhraj. Can you remember where they actually come from? Well done. They come from the tip of the tongue with the root of the upper incisors. Alto, ad, at. So the makhraj is the same. However, the sound of each letter is different, and that's down to the sifat of that letter. So when we say alto, you can see it's a heavy letter. When we look at it from a certain perspective, when we look at it from the perspective of the direction of sound, it makes it heavy. When we look at it from alto, there's a qalqala, so that's another sifah, versus at is a light letter. There's a bit of wind that comes out from the mouth when we say at. And when we say ad is another light letter, and there's a qalqala there. So you see how 3 letters from the same makhraj, from the tip of the tongue with the root of the upper incisors, they're from the same makhraj, but they have different characteristics. So these sifat help us differentiate between letters from the same makhraj. The second very important reason to why we learn sifat is to improve the pronunciation of letters. So we could say a letter from the same correct makhraj, but it wouldn't be as perfect as it could be. So we could say ash, ash, while the sheen should be ash, ashraku. So although the makhraj was correct, but it wasn't quite accurate when we kind of made it really short and said ash. Because the sheen has certain sifat, which, number one, define its length, ash, the length of the sound, or the flow of the sound, and it has sifat, or a sifat, which describes how the sound of ash, the sheen, spreads in the mouth. So the second reason why we learn sifat is to improve the pronunciation of letters. The third reason we learn sifat is to differentiate between strong letters and weak letters. For example, the ta, at is a very, very strong letter. At is a much weaker letter than the ta. And practically how this point helps us is it helps us to understand why we pronounce letters in a certain way or words in a certain way when these letters meet. So two examples when we talk about the ta and the ta. The ta is a strong letter, the ta being a weak letter. If the ta comes first in certain scenarios and the ta comes next, you pronounce the ta, then the ta. So the word baselt, baselt, you still pronounce the ta, even though there's a sukoon on top of it. Baselt. While in the opposite scenario, when the ta comes first and then the ta comes, the ta is a much stronger letter and the ta isn't pronounced. So when we pronounce waddat ta'ifah, waddat ta'ifah, the ta doesn't get pronounced at all, so we pronounce the ta. We'll go into these topics much more detail in the future, but for now let's just summarize and say that the three main reasons we learn sifat are, firstly, to differentiate letters that come from the same makhraj. Three letters can come from the same makhraj, but each of them would have different sifat. Second point is to improve the quality of pronunciation of letters. And the third point is to understand when letters meet in terms of stronger and weaker letters, how they are pronounced. Now that answers the first question. Why do we learn sifat? The second question we want to answer is, what if we don't apply sifat? What if we don't apply sifat? What happens? Well, either the letter is pronounced completely incorrectly, or at least it is inaccurate. So in one circumstance, the letter could be pronounced completely inaccurately, or completely opposite to what it's supposed to sound like, and at the bare minimum, it would be inaccurate. So if we take the sad and the sin, asa, if we don't apply certain sifat to the sad, and we make it sound asa, asa, we would have changed the pronunciation of the letter and the entire meaning of the word. So asa means to disobey. Asa means to wish that something would happen. So just by not applying sifat, we change the letter completely from one letter to the other and completely change the meaning. On the other hand, if that doesn't happen, the bare minimum that would happen is that the pronunciation of that letter wouldn't be accurate. So if we take the sheen, just like we said, if we say ash, ash, well, the makhraj is correct, but the pronunciation isn't quite accurate. It should be ash, ash. The length should be like that, the spreading of the sound of sheen within the mouth. So these things make the pronunciation of that letter more accurate. So again, if we don't apply sifat, we can either change the letter completely, or we could at least just change the quality or the accuracy of the pronunciation of that letter. So hence, that's why we apply sifat. Now, to warm you up and to give you a heads up, there will be more than 20 plus videos on the topics of sifat, and we'll have probably 10 plus lessons on sifat. Hence why we're giving it that introduction and to explain the importance of why and what if. So let's recap, summarize, and touch on those learning objectives once again. First point was we wanted to define and understand what does Sifat mean, or what are the Sifat of the letters? And we defined Sifat as characteristics or qualities that occur when we pronounce a letter that differentiate that letter or the sound of that letter from other letters. And the second point was to get an awareness and an understanding of why we study Sifat. We said Sifat help us differentiate letters from the same makhraj, and Sifat help us pronounce the letters much more accurately. And if we don't apply Sifat, we could either change the letter completely, or at the very minimum, we would make it inaccurate in terms of pronunciation. So that's an introduction to Sifat, and I look forward to speaking with you for the next 20 odd videos on Sifat. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.